For this next section, we've invited members of the agency's leadership to join us and share their perspectives about the agency's priorities. We're so pleased to have with us today Dr. Janet Woodcock, who serves now as Principal Deputy Commissioner, Andi Lipstein Fristedt, Deputy Commissioner for Policy, Legislation, and International Affairs, James Sigg, who's Deputy Commissioner for Operations and Chief Operating Officer, and Frank Yiannas, Deputy Commissioner for Food, Policy, and Response. We so appreciate each of you for taking the time to speak with us today. And I'm going to turn to each of you to come to and join our conversation. Principal Deputy Commissioner Woodcock, let's start with you. You have a new role since we last gathered. Tell us about your current priorities and what is keeping you busy.
Right. Well, I'm still involved in some of the medical product issues, such as clinical trial diversity, and a number of others. However, I have been focusing on, I'd say, two main areas. The first, Dr. Califf already alluded to, which is I'm really being a strategic partner to the foods program, because while I was acting commissioner, I really recognized the lack of resources there. We got some, we put in an ask to Congress, we got some increases, but we, really need to bolster a lot of the parts of that program, both the maternal and child health part, the infant formula, all those the toxic elements, the novel foods, so food additives and the novel foods, the whole issue of nutrition and nutrition information, like the sodium guidance that we put out to lower sodium in all the processed foods that are available to people, and so forth. And now there's a call, for example, for having retail having menu information for takeout food, because we have it for restaurants, but then if you get takeout, you might not hear or understand what you're getting. So there's a huge range for the foods program, as well as some of the other issues that they face, such as dietary supplements, and so forth. So I'm working on that, and working alongside of the folks who are already working in that area, both to increase resources and really look at how we can run these programs. And then I've been working again for quite a few months since when I was acting on what we call enterprise transformation. And that is, I think Rob was talking about subcomponent optimization or component sub-optimization or whatever you call it. And I think the FDA also is an example of that. In other words, every program, every center, whatever, had developed their own IT systems and applications. So each part of the agency runs its own separate thing. And this is very expensive. It requires a tremendous amount of support. We have a tremendous amount, say, of excess server space and so forth. And okay, it may have been good at the time when it was developed, but now, there are ways we can do this much more effectively and much less expensively. But we have to design our business processes for an enterprise level. So how do we do freedom of information, okay, at an enterprise level, so that we can get through all those as quickly as possible? How can we do inspections at enterprise level, our inventory of regulated firms and facilities and products, okay? How do we make sure that's right so that we can do risk stratification and get to the right firms and so forth, and everybody has all the information they need at the same time? And that can't happen now because of all these different systems. So I'm working with the enterprise transformation operation, and we've taken on a number of these as pilots. So I'm kind of working through all these different issues, also hiring, which Rob also mentioned, can we get an FDA hiring authorities that can help us get the right people in a timely manner for all the programs. And, if I can get those things done, I think we'll have really big steps forward, although they aren't in the policy, the real exciting areas, but they really are going to be meaningful for the programs to operate.
Absolutely. Actually, reflecting on that, Dr. Woodcock, it strikes me that you've perhaps, I can see this vision of a whole bunch of Christmas tree lights, and you've been handed all the knots to try and untangle, right? And the lights work with the tangles, but it sure would be a lot better if they were untangled and we could have more efficiency. Really appreciate that kind of overview and where you're focusing and things that really truly do need to be addressed.
Good metaphor.
Yes, yes. Let's turn to Deputy Commissioner Fristedt. Andi, we haven't previously welcomed you to the foundation stage, but I know you've been busy with domestic and international priorities. What's percolating in the policy realm and around the world?
Yeah, well, thanks, Susan. Really happy to be here and appreciate the opportunity to talk with folks today. And, I, for one, will say that I am very happy to have Dr. Woodcock here, untangling those lights. I think we all are. So I love that metaphor as well. So yeah, we are busy. First off, as I'm sure you're very well aware, we're in the midst of our user fee reauthorizations. I can tell you, certainly from my seat here at the agency, but also from my previous position in the Senate, that getting these negotiated and passed every 5 years is a Herculean task for lots of folks involved. And, it's really important to the agency when it comes to resources, of course, but also when it comes to policy that's really consequential for the agency and for patients and families across the country. So we're continuing to put really tremendous effort in there. And, we are just really grateful to our colleagues in Congress for everything they're doing, for their partnership, and really optimistic that we will see that get over the finish line in a timely manner. So lots to watch there. Aside from the user fees, we have a lot happening in the policy space. I'll hit on just a few highlights. First, in a really significant announcement last month, we announced issued 2 tobacco product standards proposed rules. So one to ban menthol in cigarettes and another to ban all characterizing flavors in cigars. And, this was a really big deal for us. Huge potential here to protect kids from getting addicted, to help currently addicted smokers quit, and to address some of the really intransigent health disparities we've been seeing across the country. So those stand to be real game changers for public health. Both Dr. Califf and Dr. Woodcock talked a little bit about nutrition, and that is definitely a place that we are really focused on in the policy space as well. President Biden recently announced that for the first time in over 50 years, the White House is going to be hosting a conference on hunger, nutrition, and health. We're really excited to be a part of that effort. We know that strengthening access to affordable, healthy food is really critical for preventing chronic disease and again, to help us advance health equity. So in that lane, one focus has been sodium. Excess sodium consumption is a huge health risk, but we know that most Americans regularly consume far more than is recommended. So last October, FDA established voluntary short-term sodium reduction targets for foods that are the source of the most sodium that's consumed. Also in the nutrition space, an exciting action we have on the horizon is FDA's work on the healthy proposed rule. So this proposed rule is aimed at both creating a healthier food supply and empowering consumers to better identify healthy foods. FDA actually first established the healthy nutrient content claim in the early 90s. And since then, nutrition science has evolved to give the agency a better understanding into what a nutrient-rich diet looks like. And this proposed rule updates the criteria for the nutrient content claim healthy to make sure that it's based on the current nutrition science. So we see this as really integral to the national food policy agenda to sort of tackle the impacts of diet-related disease. Before I move on from foods, I'll just quickly note that we also have a lot of exciting policy work happening under the agency's Closer to Zero action plan. That work's focused on reducing exposure, excuse me, to toxic elements from food eaten by babies and young children, and is a really important priority. I've mentioned health equity in the context of both tobacco and nutrition, but FDA also continues to be focused on equity in the context of clinical research. So just last month, FDA issued a new draft guidance to industry for developing plans to enroll more participants from underrepresented racial and ethnic populations into clinical trials. We know that ensuring greater diversity is really important to making sure that we can develop better treatments and that those treatments work for everybody. So that's just one aspect of our work in that space, but I think a really important one. Before I wrap, there's so much that I'd love to talk to you about. I do want to just talk quickly about some of the global work that we're doing and touch on that piece of your question. The pandemic really underscored the importance of our work around the globe, including our partnerships with foreign regulators on everything from vaccines to food policy. And we have some really exciting stuff coming up. So first, FDA has organized the 3rd Global Biotechnology Regulators Forum. So this builds on success we had in 2019 and 2021, bringing together regulators from around the world on this work stream. We've had some regulatory developments and product authorizations globally since that last meeting. So it's a really important time to bring regulators together, exchange experiences around plant and animal biotechnology, including genome editing, and discuss some of the challenges and opportunities there. We also have some work happening to protect consumers against illicit health products. FDA's Europe office and our Office of Criminal Investigations are working together to organize a joint program with the OECD Task Force on Countering Illicit Trades. So this focuses on sort of a whole of government approach to protecting consumers. And actually the first of 3 meetings on that will be this month. And just one other thing globally, I would note, we've engaged for a long time with African regulators on vaccine-related matters, largely through a cooperative agreement with the WHO. And now we're expanding that engagement, including by developing a virtual seminar for the staff of the Africa Medicines Agency. And we're hoping following that up with in-person engagement later this year. So that, regulator to regulator, opportunities to just really connect the dots across the globe is just continues to be really important to us, and we're really excited by that work. So I'll stop there. Tons to talk about. Really happy to be here.
And Andi, thank you so much. I'm was tracking all of those policy priorities, and I know that you couldn't cover all of them, but also then important underscoring kind of the global and the domestic front and all that's moving along. So thanks for those highlights that remind us of the kind of the breadth of work that has to be done so that we get to a better place and navigate so many of these challenges. So really appreciate that. I want to turn now to your colleague, Deputy Commissioner Sigg. Jim, I'm not sure that your name is quite as well known outside the fda.hhs.gov email domain as it is to everyone else who's there, but your role is essential. Tell us about your work, and you've navigated this very different deployment of staff and everything else. I want to hand you the microphone.
Thanks, Susan, and I too am happy to be here. You're right. The vast majority of our work is internal. It's seen to within the agency and the department, but it's the operations arm of the FDA. We like to consider ourselves the heartbeat of the agency. We enable the programs to meet the public health mission. Typical operation functions, government and business functions, HR, ethics, facilities, EEO, security, emergency management, budget, of course. So the typical operations, very important work to be able to enable the programs to continue. And the challenge of the last 26 months or so, that work continued. That work had to continue. I'm very proud of being part of this staff that not only continued when we shifted to more of a maximum workplace flexibilities, work at home for most. we are able to work with Dr. Woodcock and other senior leaders to really manage and lead the operational response to COVID for the agency, all while the top priority being the safety of our employees. Enabling the programs to carry on their mission during the last 26 months, but still, like I said, emphasizing the safety of our staff. So the work continues. I'll talk a little bit later, I think, about what that new norm may look like, but very happy to be here, and thank you for having me.
Absolutely. I think when many, in the FDA community think about the agency, they think about the work product of the agency and less about the people who it is who get it done. Not out of disrespect, just you're producing so much work. And as you noted, you're the heartbeat in making sure that the folks have email addresses and equipment that works and other components. So thank you for joining us today. I'm going to round us out in our initial tour of deputy commissioners, and then we're going to come back to a conversation and turn to Deputy Commissioner Frank Yiannas. And I'm going to guess, Deputy Commissioner Yiannas, that if we had taped Commissioner Califf's remarks today versus last week, he might have said something else about food safety. And so let's talk with you. It's been nearly 11 years since the Food Safety Modernization Act was signed into law. We know a lot has been accomplished, but there's been some recent criticism that some of that Fisma work remains unfinished. Tell us about the current state of implementing the Food Safety Modernization Act and what remains to be done.
Thank you, Susan. It's also a pleasure for me to be with you and your audience today. And that's a good question. We know there's been some recent criticism on FISMA, and I would tell you, just like everyone else at FDA, we take criticism very seriously. I'm going to offer you a balcony level view of what's been accomplished with FISMA, because it's really breathtaking, the amount of work that's been accomplished over the past decade. But if you allow me, before we get into FISMA, I wanted to tackle an issue head on. And this is this issue of infant formula. I know it's top of mind to a lot of people listening. It's a top priority for us at FDA. And I want to provide just a picture of what's happening across the country and how we got here. Before the recall, and we're all reading about this recall that occurred with Abbott's production facility in Sturgis. Before the recall, data was telling us that the available infant formula across the country on shelf was about an 89% in stock. 89% of the different infant formulas that might be offered at a grocery store were in stock. Not everything was in stock, and that's actually depressed compared to good times, pre-pandemic levels of the 90–95%. And there were reports in the media about stresses on infant formula, just like there have been reports about stresses on a lot of commodities. I think many of the listeners will know that in February, we were able to piece together that there were 4 cases of Corynebacter sakazaki among infants, 2 deaths that might have been contributed by Corynebacter. And the FDA investigated that all of those products had been consumed, were produced in the Sturgis Abbott facility, a facility located in Sturgis, Michigan. We went in and did an inspection, found conditions that didn't meet our standards. And because of that, Abbott voluntarily decided to do a recall. In abundance of caution, we're glad they did. And they voluntarily decided to shut down. So that shutdown of one of the major manufacturers of infant formula products in the United States, coupled with an already stressed pandemic type level in stock, has caused some disruptions. We've heard some data reported in the news. I will tell you, we try to use gold standards of metrics, such as IRI, that measures sales data under contract by about 90% of all retailers and drug chains. And the metrics that we're getting through 5.8 was the on-shelf availability of 79%. So you can see a 10% drop, largely driven through the recall event. That means that on average there's 79%, but that means in some markets there's more, higher rates in stock, in some markets there's lower. We're working 24/7 to make sure that we address this market imbalance, the distribution of products. We're working every week contacting manufacturers. I can tell you that they're reporting to us significant increases in production volume. We're measuring sales for the month of April. Sales volume of infant formula was up 15% compared to the month prior to the recall. So we know they're doing their part. Sales units are up, but nevertheless, there is this uneven distribution in the formula marketplace, and it's causing anxiety and stress. And we have a lot of empathy for those parents. And so we won't stop until we can address these issues and get the products that consumers want, the brands that they want, at the right place and at the right time. Now, real quickly regarding Fisma, let me just tell you that nobody could have anticipated how much work Fisma was. It was the most significant transformation to our food safety laws in about a century. And that message Congress had was right. Congress told us that it wasn't enough to just detect foodborne illness outbreaks, but we had to do more to prevent them. Over the course of the past decade, the FDA has issued 8 foundational Fisma rules. They're real critical rules, such as preventative control, the produce safety rule, intentional adulteration, and so on. But there's 2 pieces that are a work in progress that we're really excited about and be game changer. One is in November of 2020, we issued a proposed food traceability rule. We believe that a more traceable and transparent food system is a safer food system. There's no question about that. And so the proposed rule identified a couple of critical components that are important. And they're called key data elements. What are the type of structured or standardized data that nodes in the food system are required to keep? And the critical tracking events. Where in that food system should those records be kept? And then Congress also asked us to identify the types of foods that would benefit from this enhanced record keeping. So we've issued a proposed rule. We've held 3 public meetings. And I can tell you we're on track to have a final food traceability rule by November of this year. It's a big, big deal. It's really leading the globe and setting a more transparent food system. The second one is ag water. And I know many of your listeners will be interested in this because it was originally in the produce safety rule that was issued in 2015. That ag water standard was put on pause. So we got feedback that growers and farming communities told us they thought it was too much of a one-size-fits-all. We took that feedback to heart. We listened. We visited literally hundreds of different farms. And late last year, we issued a revised proposed ag water standard. I think everybody knows that the importance of water for drinking purposes, right? Safe drinking water has been known since antiquity. What this ag water standard does for the first time, it allows FDA to say the quality and safety of water used for agricultural purposes is important too. And so this proposed rule, while it's a proposed rule, if finalized, will require farmers to do an annual assessment to look if there are potential introduction of hazards to their water system, and if so, mitigate them. And I believe it will be a game changer for food safety because while we know produce is generally safe, when foodborne illnesses do occur in this country, too often they're linked to produce items, and water is a conduit of those pathogens. And so I'm really excited about 2 remaining critical Fisma rules. And I think they'll do a dramatic job in improving public health in this country and around the world.
Frank, thank you so much for that. I'm struck. I was at the agency just before, when all the work was being done to, craft Fisma and move it forward. And recall that someone had said, "Oh, when we get that passed, things, we'll have this dramatic change." We had to say, wait. There's it's actually then that all of the work that begins to do the what you've just spoken about in those proposed rules. And it seems like perhaps the food traceability rule may create an environment where you have better data to look at things like the infant formula and the supply chain and what are things going on there. So there's some improvements on the horizon, unfortunately not quite available today, but the work is being done. Yeah. And so appreciate I having seen crises like this, I'm confident that your team, everyone at the agency who's working on this is working diligently to address and help with the supply dynamics there with the infant formula situation. I'm really glad you took an opportunity to speak to that.
You're welcome.
So I'll note we have had a few questions coming in and want to bring you all back together for this discussion. So we're going to come all back on the panel here, and I'm going to put a few more questions to you in our time. I'm going to go back to the top of my slide where I had you listed and throw the first one to Dr. Woodcock. There's a new entity outside of FDA, but it's a new entity in the federal government health space with the Advanced Research Projects Agency for Health, or Arpa-H. Just looking at Arpa-H, it looks like a lot of their work will end up in front of FDA. How do you see FDA interacting with Arpa-H to assure that acceleration of transformative interventions and technologies? And then I'll note, if anybody else wants to jump in after Dr. Woodcock picks that up, please do.
Well, the idea behind ARPA-H, there are several ideas. One is, of course, letting people run with projects, giving them a defined amount of time and a fair amount of money per DARPA, right? And getting the best minds to work on a project, you can get something through. But then we think about, say, warp speed, okay? And some of the ideas there to get things all the way through, not get them discovered, because DARPA, of course, is more about the discovery. Then they do some handoffs to get things into the hands of healthcare providers and patients. You have to go through the development process, all right? Not just the discovery process. And the development process requires to be fastest and most efficient, a partnership with FDA. And so that's what we saw during COVID, is FDA went sort of all out and tried to rapidly respond to proposals, to get back right away, to have the meetings, to have the early engagement. And of course, in the warp speed, it was even the manufacturing. They were manufacturing at risk, starting before they knew what the trial results would be. So once they had the trial results in hand, they'd be ready to go with finished product. Now, I think the public now expects this is how things work all the time. From different emails I've been getting. Okay.
Right. Why can't you just do that for everything?
That's exactly right. And so, of course, one of the lubricants there in accelerators was dollars, right? Because in some cases, the industry staked themselves. In other cases, the government provided that financing at risk of manufacturing and acceleration of programs. So if ARPA-H is to be successful, not just in discovering and early development, but actually getting innovations, real innovation through the healthcare system, FDA is going to have to be right on top of that. Now, that may not happen in the first year of the program or something, because they have to go and get themselves organized and figure out their projects and figure out and start accelerating their discovery and so forth. But not too far in advance of that, then FDA will have to weigh in. And another example, NIH got a fair amount of money for diagnostics for COVID, and they set up programs that were very helpful, including doing some of the clinical evaluation of those diagnostics. And they had access then to panels of reagents and so forth that any individual small manufacturer wouldn't have. But that's what you have to use to test a diagnostic, to look at its performance. So that program, RADx, was very helpful, okay? But those require funding, right? And they received a lot of funding to do that. So I think it's going to have to be a partnership in the later parts of it. And I'm not sure how FDA, because we have so many other responsibilities, and say if the user fee programs go through, there'll be all sorts of commitments that we would have agreed to with industry to do things, this and that and the other thing, write guidances, have meetings, et cetera, hire staff. So this will be very interesting. I think part of it will depend on how quickly ARPA-H can actually get products to the candidate stage, right? And that's when you really need to partner with the agency, because if you wait, like, what kind of preclinical testing should you do, right? What should you think about as far as what the clinical population would look like? What kind of comparison groups do you need? Do you need natural history data and so forth and so on? I think it'll be real interesting as an experiment. And I think the FDA will have to be deeply involved in this.
Right, because it's not, as you so articulately put it, it's not just the discovery, but how do we actually get it
Right.
through, the regulatory system, which we need.
Right. Because really, Susan, everybody says it's the regulators, but really you have to do an evaluation.
Right.
We set what the evaluation is. So they say, oh, it's a regulator. But what are you going to do? Put something on the market without knowing whether it works or not? So there has to be some kind of clinical evaluation, right? And
Right.
what we do is we try to provide some clarity about what that should be and some societal consensus, because obviously there are trade-offs. A lot of people like more certainty. Well, then it's going to take longer and take more money and more patience. And other people are happier with less certainty. And then it goes maybe faster because you haven't, dotted each I and so forth. And as you know, right now, we're not having a lot of societal consensus on these issues. And so that's yet another, FDA always gets right in the middle of that.
Yeah.
So if Arpa-H is promising all this acceleration, well, some people don't like that if it involves, less certainty about performance.
Right. And so is there that structured, rigorous process? And as you said, clarity, certainly, some of the work we did with the Center for Biologics on the COVID-19 vaccines and what consumers wanted to have confidence in those vaccines,
Right.
they wanted to know that there were scientists kind of working on the issue and making the decision, looking at that clear assessment and making the decision about whether the product should indeed become available.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah. Fabulous. Thank you. So definitely some coordination to come. Andi, let's turn to you talking about coordination. There's a lot of discussion on Capitol Hill about accelerated approval, and then doesn't quite align. There's a little cognitive dissonance with the calls for broader patient access to unapproved drugs. What, if anything, should be addressed in the statutory structure for the accelerated approval pathway?
Yeah, well, thanks for that, Susan. And it's a good follow-up on coordination, and it's a good follow-up on certainty, right? So we have some themes here. So, it's a great question. It's something we've been thinking a lot about here at the agency. So, when a drug is granted accelerated approval, it means the sponsor can bring the drug to market based on data that is reasonably predictive of the drug's clinical benefit, and simultaneously conduct a post-approval confirmatory trial to verify that benefit. So, as I think probably, whoever is asking this question and a lot of folks out there are aware, it's why it's so critical that sponsors, expeditiously complete the confirmatory trials. And in the hopefully rare situations in which a trial does not succeed, the FDA has what it needs to quickly remove that drug from the market. So I mentioned the user fee reauthorization process a bit earlier, and it is definitely coming into play here. We're really encouraged that the bipartisan draft Energy and Commerce Committee user fee bill includes a provision that would allow FDA to require that confirmatory trial be underway prior to approval, and also to establish conditions for the trial, including the expected completion date, which is something that we've been really focused on. That bill would also allow FDA to much more quickly remove products from market if, in those situations, like I mentioned, where a confirmatory trial doesn't succeed or the sponsor fails to complete it in a timely manner. This is authority that the agency asked for in the president's fiscal year 23 budget. So we're really excited to see it there. It would improve both the timeliness and the quality of confirmatory studies for drugs under accelerated approval, and at the same time, minimize the time that drugs can remain on the market without confirmation of the clinical benefit. So all of which is to say, we're really pleased to see bipartisan support for those provisions in the House, and really hope that we'll see those continue to move forward as part of the user fee process.
So it seems like that will help. We did a program with some of the folks at CEDAR on accelerated approval and talked about it being structured uncertainty. And so, right, so here's some other components to help with that, get us through the uncertainty to a clearer picture.
That's exactly right. It builds up that frame that we need here.
Yeah, excellent. Well, I'm going to turn now to Deputy Commissioner Sigg. You signaled that you might talk about this, and it aligns with some questions that are coming in. And in fact, I'm going to bet that somebody somewhere has an office pool or some other betting structure as to when the agency returns appreciably to in-person events. Tell us more about that.
Well, thank you for the question. I'm not aware of any betting pools going on about
I'm not
this,
endorsing
'cause we
any.
don't do
I'm
that,
just
right.
saying there might be some.
Right. No, but thank you for that question. Yeah. As I mentioned earlier, the majority of our workforce went to maximum telework, but I do want to acknowledge the hundreds of staff that did come in and continue to work on site or out where they needed to go due to the nature of their work, the non-portable nature of their work. So I did want to acknowledge that. Early on in the pandemic, agency leadership did acknowledge that we got to figure out what that new normal is going to look like. I think we all know that, the way work is accomplished has been viewed differently throughout this pandemic, and it will in the future. So really excited to announce that we launched the pilot about a month ago, 6-month pilot to really look at that and to get some data, collect some data from our staff and their supervisors and stakeholders that we can then present to senior leadership, Dr. Woodcock and others, so that we can really look at what's working, what do we need to do differently. And then again, assuming if that pilot is successful in determining what our new normal is going to look like, there's a possibility, a real potential for some cost savings too, when we look at our footprint and the needed footprint going forward in that new normal. So we're really excited about that as well. As far as more in-person events, that's really depending on the county, the location of those events. We follow closely the CDC community guidance, the guidance on the community levels, and we work with HHS as well to determine when that is appropriate and the scope of those events as we move forward. So we continue to do that.
So reminding us that, well, as other organizations are kind of taking this strategic look of saying how much, right, and thinking about that in the structure of staff, and then obviously there's a virus that impacts how much we could do on the in-person return.
Right. So
yeah.
we want to do it strategically and have the data to really look at this and do it right for the future.
Yeah. Makes sense. Although I know there will be lots of people thinking about commuting and a whole bunch of other things that will factor into that. Deputy Commissioner Yiannas, I've got another food question for you. Not surprisingly, and this one acknowledges that the foods program has such a challenging set of responsibilities, and you talked a bit about those. Recognizing it generates headlines, and there is a lot of change going on in the food system writ large. The FDA has a bold vision for that continued modernization. What else can you tell us about the plans for FDA to keep pace with that changing food system?
Thank you, Susan. It's a great question, and one that energizes me, because the reality is the rate of change around us is accelerating, and it's happening with food too. The food system has always been changing. I've heard this quote, some of you might have heard it, but I like repeating it. It says, the rate of change has never been this fast, and it will never be this slow again. And that's what we're feeling. I think we're all feeling this. I like to say that we're in the midst of a food revolution. Some of it accelerated because of the pandemic and the lessons learned on how vulnerable our food supply chains are. And so let me tell you what I mean, and I don't think I'm exaggerating that we're in a food revolution. We see reformulation of foods to healthier options happening all around the planet. We see new foods being produced. You heard about this, gene-edited cell culture foods. We see the food system increasingly becoming digitized. We see novel production methods. And so these are modern times, and we believe that we need more modern approaches. We think Congress had it right when it said FDA has to continue to modernize its approaches. That vision 10 years ago was right. And so we've paused, we've assembled 100 men and women from FDA, we've talked to people outside of FDA, and we developed a bold vision for the future that we call the new era of smarter food safety. That's not walking away from Fisma, but building on Fisma. And primarily with this lens that's well suited for Dr. Caleb's arrival, that better food safety in the 21st century will begin and end with better data. Right? Think about it. The 20th century was the Industrial Revolution. The 21st century is the digital revolution, being able to take large volumes of data and make sense of it with new sensing tools such as artificial intelligence, the Internet of Things, distributed ledger technology. And so we have a vision and we've laid it out. I'll give you a couple examples because I don't want your audience to think, hey, FDA is chasing the shiny coin, but how we want to use these new tools to solve some of the problems that, quite frankly, for somebody that's been at this 3 decades, I thought we would never be able to solve. Seafood is a perfect example. The United States imports about 94% of the seafood the American public consumes. Most of it comes from abroad. It's a unique category. That's not the case for others, but we have lots of data. We've been importing large volumes of seafoods for years. We have a unique benchmark state-of-the-art system called Predict, but we had an interest in seeing if we start leveraging this technology called machine learning, a subset of artificial intelligence. Can we take that large volume of historical data and create more predictive capabilities to point us to which container might be of greater concern? And so far, a couple of pilots that we've been promising. And so that's an example of the new era of smarter food safety, building on Fisma by the use of emerging technologies. I'll just real quickly give your audience 2 more because it's really, really exciting. Another one, we talked about food traceability. When you see in the event of an outbreak, just think about a couple of Thanksgivings ago when there was a concern about romaine lettuce. What did CDC and FDA do? Say, avoid eating romaine lettuce until we figure out where the contamination comes from. Well, it often takes us weeks, if we can even get back to source, where there are new and emerging technologies, work that we've seen piloted already that can trace foods back to source in seconds, not days or not hours, not weeks. So we have an interest in exploring distributed ledger technology and others to trace foods back to source. And the last one that I'll mention that's actually being used in the infant formula incident is a digital platform called 21 Forward. At the beginning of the pandemic, we knew that once COVID started reaching rural America, where the majority of farms and food production centers are located, small disruptions to workforces on the rate of 5 to 10% would affect food production, meaning worker safety and food supply chain continuity being 2 sides of the same coin. So we started mapping FDA-regulated food establishments on a map and overlaying it with data from CDC, such as COVID transmission at the county level, with predictive analytics, where were things going? And we used that technology platform to further strengthen those food production assets to minimize disruptions and them going down. And in fact, we're using that same tool right now to help manage the infant formula. And so the new era of smarter food safety is more than a tagline or slogan. And FDA does have a bold vision on how we can further modernize our efforts to protect the American consumer.
Well, and I think you said you don't want people to think it's the shiny penny, but the agency has to keep pace with kind of those developments and then incorporate what they can from the different approaches. You did also, though, you also mentioned kind of the workforce dynamic, and so I'm gonna close out with a question, probably one that Janet or Jim wants to pick up, but I'll let you kind of duke it out who wants to say anything. But it's a competitive marketplace for talent, and all of the work that you all have been talking about, we know is done by people on the other side of the phone or the Zoom or the email address. And I recall that it used to be a challenge to do the recruiting and to bring people in. Is that going better, or kind of what's happening with the recruiting and the hiring approaches?
I would say in the areas where we have cures authority, it's taken a long time to get our own pay system established and to disentangle it from the way we used to do it, because people, that's a big change, but it is becoming much more effective. And what it really can do for us is get people in very quickly once a qualified candidate is identified. And that is tremendous, because if you have a hot candidate, they won't wait 8, 10 weeks, 180 days sometimes to get a tentative job offer. They're just not going to wait. We have to get them an offer as soon as we know we want them. Okay. And so we're working on that. And I think that with the Cures Authority will be able to do that. But we've been talking about the foods program and some of these other programs. We don't have those authorities. and it's still very, very difficult. And of course, there we're not really competitive at the executive level or, with partners in a law firm. It just gets too tasty, especially for people later in their career, to forego that salary as they're thinking about kids in college or their retirement or what have you. So there's still considerable stresses. Now, I think the agency staff is so devoted to the mission that people stay on, right? But I do think the Cures Authority has been very helpful.
Yeah, and Susan, I can add, as well as and I agree with everything Dr. Woodcock said, as well as another way we want to try to address the competitive workforce environment that's out there, very highly competitive, is the pilot and the flexibilities that we hope to be able to provide going forward to increase the candidacy pool, to then be able to bring them in quickly. But I think that will help our candidacy pool and recruitment as well as retention to help that continue that work-life balance.
And as well as diversity, because not everyone wants to leave their community and come work in the DC area. And so the fact that we can have a more distributed workforce who can contribute just as much, or actually we get more work out of people if they work remotely generally, is very helpful. Yeah.
Great. So that looks like some things are working well, other improvements on the horizon, and then there's some gaps maybe that need to be bridged to make sure that the entire agency has the opportunity to bring more great people like you all to White Oak or to virtual FDA.